I want to start off by painting a picture, and it's a picture that maybe many of you might find familiar. Two parents come into my office, and they are concerned about their son Dennis, and nobody can quite figure out what's happening with Dennis. He's just a frustrating kid. He's frustrating for his teachers. He's been kind of puzzling since he was in preschool, and now he's in middle school. And his parents come in and they say this to me. So, people have been telling me for years, his mother says, how smart Dennis is. But if he's so smart, why is he so slow? And she says, I can see why everyone is so frustrated with Dennis, because I'm frustrated with him too. He can't get anything done. Whether it's getting his homework done or putting on his shoes or even just taking a message, he can't get it done. He gets so excited about writing a history paper. He can't wait to talk to me about the topic that he's picked and all the things he's going to write down and do and how this is going to be the best paper he's ever written. And then when it comes time to actually do the paper, he just can't seem to do it. He just sits there, he stares at the pencil nib, he just can't get it done. If I didn't know him so well, his mother says, I think he just didn't care, but I know he cares an awful lot. His dad thinks he's lazy. His teacher also thinks he just doesn't care, and I'm spending my life yelling at him to get things done. How did we get into this mess? She asks me. So there was a time when I would hear these kinds of stories, and I would think, well, probably this child has ADHD. He can't get things done, he's disorganized, he has problems with executive function skills, so he probably falls into that ADHD basket. And I became interested in this topic because over the years I had seen more and more kids who had trouble getting stuff done, but who didn't always meet criteria for ADHD. They weren't classically ADHD. Some of them were, many of them weren't. Many of them had issues like dyslexia or anxiety. And some of them just didn't have anything other than what we called slow processing speed. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is the issue of processing speed. And I'm going to do a few things. One, I want to just explain what it is, and then I want to sort of disabuse you of the notion that it's a willful sort of process. I want to talk to you about how we measure processing speed, what it looks like at a brain level, and then also talk a little bit about what we can do about it. So processing speed, so what is it? Well, if I just define it very simply, it's how long it takes for us to get something done. It's not necessarily how deep we think about something, it's not how fast we think, but it's how fast we can actually execute a task. Now, it's always been thought of as an executive function skill, and it still is. And for those of you who, I'm sure everybody in this room has heard of the term executive function skills, and it's things like goal setting, organizing, planning ahead, remembering what it is we're supposed to do at any particular time. And again, processing speed has always been thought of as one of those skills. But I kind of think of processing speed as not just another executive function skill. I really think that if executive functioning is the car, processing speed is the engine. And so having a faster engine or a more efficient engine allows us to use our executive functioning skills. So I actually see kids with very, very good executive functioning skills, terrifically organized, great at set shifting, who have slow processing speed, who still can't perform at a level that they're capable of performing at. So a more efficient engine allows the car to function at a higher level of efficiency. Now, alternatively, there are kids who have very poor executive functioning in lots of areas and then have processing speed weaknesses, and those are the kids who I find are at most risk. So regardless of whether or not you have good executive functioning or not, processing speed is an important component of trying to figure out how are these kids going to respond to interventions. There's a big cost to having slower processing speed. So I've just put a few things here. A slower cost to being able to express yourself well, both verbally and then also written. Problems with even academic tasks outside of the fact that you might have or not have dyslexia. You may have slower reading fluency skills. You might have trouble understanding directions quickly, trouble retrieving information from memory. Even though your memory is good, you have trouble kind of retrieving that information really quickly. I do find that kids with this kind of profile have problems finishing almost anything on time. And one thing that surprised us when we started to actually look at these kids was that a lot of them have problems with social interactions. And so, I started thinking about kids with slower processing speed just because I started to see so many of them over the last decade. And then I was interested in it and then started studying it. So as we started, anecdotally, I would hear from parents that, oh, my child really has trouble with social problems, but they didn't necessarily at all have problems actually socially relating to people, but in real life they had problems socially, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So one of the reasons why I think kids with this kind of profile have become more interesting clinically is because there have always been kids with slower processing speed. It's one of those traits that runs across people, across disorders, but our world has gotten so much faster. So when you had a slower pace of doing something, you were allowed 20, 30, 40 years ago to kind of just develop. And by the time you reached college and adulthood, you found your path, and your slower processing speed didn't get in the way of your ability to learn because your output wasn't what it is now. Your ability to have to multitask wasn't what it is now. So it's become more important because our world has changed. So let me talk, before I get into some of the things about how we measure processing speed, let me just talk to you about there are different kinds of processing speed. And it's hard to say that people have problems in just one of these areas. What we find is that the way we measure processing speed usually hits on more than one of these areas. But there are at least 3 areas that we can look at. There's visual processing speed, there's verbal processing, and then there's motor speed. So visual processing is as simple as how quickly our eyes dilate to light. People with slower visual processing speed have more car accidents, have difficulty looking up phone numbers in a phone book. And these studies that I'm commenting on are studies that were done with adults. And a lot of what we know about processing speed, we know about adults who have kind of lost their ability to process things quickly. As we get older, much older, processing speed is one of those things that we kind of lose. And so a lot of the studies that have been done on processing speed, like I said, have been done on older people. Now, that one of the studies, difficulty looking up phone numbers, you can see is kind of an older study because no one has to look up a phone number anymore. But you can see how those sorts of tasks, that ability to kind of do something very quickly, is linked to other sorts of issues as well. Verbal processing, how quickly we can hear something and react to it, how quickly someone asks something in a classroom and we come up with an answer. People with problems with verbal processing are linked to problems with nearly all aspects of verbal memory, comprehending instructions. And then there's also motor speed, just how quickly we can do something like put pegs in a board, or how quickly we can take notes, for example. But you can kind of think about that most of the things we do don't just tap into one of these areas. So it's complicated. And what this child looks like in the classroom, it's that child sometimes who looks confused, appears to be absent-minded, appears sometimes to not care. Sometimes these kids just don't really get involved in doing a lot of things at all. Oftentimes they won't get started on new tasks because they look at something and they say, oh, it's going to take me so long to get that done, I might as well not even start. And ironically, they need to start earlier. And what I frequently find is that these kids are very often very optimistic about their time ability to get something done. So they'll say, oh no, that's not going to take me that long, I can get that done. And so they go to the very last minute and then they realize, oh, I don't have time to do it, so I'm not even going to do it. And then like I say here, I find a small portion of these kids use their coping mechanism of rushing through. So they see something, it looks hard, they don't know if they're going to be able to do it quite right, and so they just rush because they'd rather just be the first one done with something than be the last one done. And they'd rather be the first one done and have it done wrong, but at least have it done because it gives them a sense of accomplishment. So like I said, I want to disabuse you of this notion that this is a willful kind of thing. Because I have had parents say, is there anything my child can do well? It's like, yes, there are lots of things, even though it feels sometimes like they can't. So let me start by talking a little bit about how we measure processing speed, just to give you a glimpse. So my clinical work is in the area of pediatric neuropsychology. So I evaluate kids who are coming to me because their parents want to know, does my child have a learning disability? Do they have ADHD? Do they have an autism spectrum disorder? Do they have an emotional problem like anxiety or depression? So the clinic that I work in and direct sees kids with lots of different disorders and learning challenges. So let me just show you a couple of the tests that we use to look at this. One of our most sensitive tests is the coding subtest. And on this test, you can see that up in that, your left-hand corner, you see that there are numbers, and each number is associated with a different marking. And what the child has to do in this test is write down that mark underneath the corresponding number. And this test is really very sensitive to kids with more general processing speed subtests. So I time them for 2 minutes, I see how many they do, I compare them to kids their own age, and kids with slower coding skills oftentimes have a lot more challenges in the classroom. You can see that what you have to do in a classroom is you have to look up at the board, you have to look down, look up. It's a lot of this kind of processing speed. Now when we're thinking about verbal versus visual versus motor, you can see that this really pulls towards visual processing and motor processing. A simpler form of this test is from symbol search. So what the child, this is for younger children, what they have to do is look at that left-hand corner or left-hand part of the page, and then they have to decide whether or not that shape is in the group of shapes to the right, and do that as quickly as they can. Another kind of processing speed subtest, again, it just very simply gets at, you see a red square and a yellow triangle, and they have to cross out all the red squares and all the yellow triangles. So you can kind of imagine how that would be. Another kind of test that measures processing speed, very simple test of verbal processing, is what we call the Stroop. Now in this test, all the child has to do is read these words on the page as quickly as they can, and I time them for 45 seconds and see how many they get. So it's just red, green, red, blue. So it just gives us a sense of how quickly they can do something very simple. Now the next part of this test, they have to name colors. So I have X's printed in different colors, and all they have to do is name the color. So you can see how this gets just a little bit tougher, a little bit harder, because now we're not just reading words. Once we learn to read, words just, we can't help but read the words. But now they have to pull up the color. So again, blue, red, green, red. You can see how you would do on something like that. And then a more difficult part of this test, and maybe some of you have seen these on coffee mugs or t-shirts, but it's actually a real test that we use. And on this, the child doesn't read the word. They have to say what color the word is printed in. So you can kind of try this yourself. It's not that easy, because what your brain has to do is inhibit your natural response, which is to read the word. We read words regardless of what font they're in or what color they're in. So you have to kind of switch that part off in your brain to read now, to say now the color. So that would be blue, red, green, blue. So this is a much more complicated task. Kids with very simple processing speed problems have more trouble with these simple tasks than they do with these more complicated tasks. Now this is a task we often use to look at impulsivity in kids with ADHD. So kids with ADHD often have trouble inhibiting their impulses. So in this case, the impulse would be to read the word, not tell me the color the word is printed in. So kids with more simple processing speed, you can see how they have more difficulty with the simple stuff, and they do better at the more difficult stuff. Another kind of processing speed test that has a simple and a more complex component to it is what we call trail making test. And on this test, and this is for younger kids, it gets a little bit more numbers for older kids and adults. What they have to do here is just connect the dots as quickly as they can. So just imagine just doing this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then in a more complicated form of this test, what they have to do is set shift. So we all know that kids with ADHD have trouble shifting from one task to another. This kind of measures this ability. So what you have to do is connect the dots in order, but alternate between numbers and letters. So you can even kind of do this to yourself. So it's like 1A, 2B. So you have to keep two things in mind at the same time. Now, again, kids with ADHD oftentimes have trouble with this. People with dementia, as they get older, this is one of those tasks that we find is very sensitive to your ability to kind of keep track of things. But what I find is that kids with the more simpler processing speed deficits, again, have more trouble on this kind of test. And their parents will say, well, if they have trouble with this, why do they not have trouble with the more complicated task? But they have trouble on this more very simple task. And this is something to think about because I'm going to spend a lot of time today talking about what kids with this kind of profile don't do well. But they do a lot of other things very well. And one of those things is to kind of take their time and not be that impulsive. So they again, do better on these sort of simple tasks. They do better on these more complex tasks. Another sort of simple task of processing speed, again, just giving you an idea of how we measure this, is on this test, kids see this on paper and they have circles, they see these circles, and there are squares in each circle. And all they have to do is look at each row and cross out the circle with the most squares in it. So this is for younger kids. For older kids, this kind of processing speed test is one in which they look at numbers and then have to cross out the biggest number in each row. So you can see that when we think about intelligence, when I show you these sorts of tasks, this isn't intelligence. Even though people with slower processing speed sometimes feel like they're not very smart. But this isn't stuff about being smart, it's about being, again, just quick at the simple stuff. One of the analogies I like to use is, and this definitely dates me, although Lucille Ball was way before my time, but I watched the reruns when I was a kid. But Lucille Ball has that one show where she's working in the chocolate factory. And the chocolate is coming along, and she's got to just watch, very much like looking at these numbers. Where's the biggest number? How is the chocolate coming? Is it all, or are they all the same? Am I doing, that quality control? And she doesn't have time to look at them all. That's coming too fast. And so what does she do? She does some maladaptive coping skills. She pops it in her mouth, she puts it in her pocket, and when somebody comes to see what's going on, she pretends that everything's just fine. And I think that's a way of kind of thinking about kids with a slower processing speed. They wind up trying to cope the best way they can, and then when somebody sort of calls them on it, they're like, I'm fine. So there are other kinds of ways to measure processing speed. There are lots of tests that we can do, and in a test battery like the one that I would do, I would include tests of academic fluency, reading fluency, math fluency, how fast can they do math facts. Very often these things are impaired in kids who have this slower processing speed style. So I also mention things like even just how fast they put pegs in a board, how fast they can tap their finger, verbal fluency, or things like tell me as many animals as you can in a minute, or tell me as many words as you can that begin with the letter F, for example. So it's complicated. It includes a lot of different things. It includes things like scanning for the right kind of details, understanding visual symbols, understanding what someone is asking you to do, working quickly, working methodically. It involves, in many cases, hand-eye coordination. So it's a complicated topic. And I find that many kids have trouble in one area, more than one area, and very often kids have trouble in all of these areas. Now, before I get into kind of talking about how the brain functions in processing speed, I want to just mention that processing speed is not a new idea. So when we look back at psychology and when it started as a science. One of the things that the people who were starting psychology and starting to study human behavior in the brain, they really wanted to quantify things. And when you think back to the late 1800s, we didn't have a lot of ways of quantifying things. But one of the things we could do is time people on different things. So one of the first areas, some of the first experiments in psychology and looking at brain and behavior were done on processing speed, because they thought, researchers thought, that if we could measure somebody's processing speed, their ability to, again, their eyes could dilate to light, or how quickly they stopped or started a task, if we could make the correlation that that is the same as intelligence, well then we're onto something here. And what they found was there wasn't a correlation between processing speed and intelligence. So this whole idea of processing speed completely fell out of favor, because it doesn't mean anything, because it didn't click with our hypothesis that being fast means being smarter, so no one studied it. And then when you think about the late 1900s and in middle 1900s, what was happening in the field of psychology and psychiatry, we had Freud, and then we had the behaviorists, and this whole notion of processing speed just wasn't important. But more recent theories of intelligence have incorporated processing speed, and our ability to actually look at the brain in real time, fMRIs, our ability to really look at what's happening in the brain, has led us to become more interested in this topic. And then again, as I mentioned before, the world has become a lot faster. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about brain and behavior, but I just want to at least just mention that there are real biological causes for slower processing speed. So we know that there are different areas of the brain that are associated with different functioning that we have. No one area of the brain has been associated with slower processing speed, and I get asked this question all the time by parents. So where is it in his brain that's causing him to be slower at these kinds of tasks? And I wish I could say there was one specific area. But recent research has kind of looked at this at the cell level, perhaps, and we don't have an answer to why this occurs and why slower processing speed happens. But it's probably complicated. Now, we know that there are cells, and I don't mean to bring you back to intro biology, but just to kind of remind you guys that there are cells, and the cells talk to one another. And they talk to one another across synapses, and neurotransmitters are the way that our cells talk to one another. And I'm really simplifying this a lot. But in a child or an adult with slower processing speed, there have been some early studies that have looked at maybe there are some different reasons why some brains just process information slower than others. One could be because of neurotransmitters. So again, it's that between the two, at that synaptic knob, that little space between the cells, those neurotransmitters may be different in some people. They may have too much, they may have too little of certain things. Another reason might be because of poor myelin. And myelin is the coating, that sheath there, you can see, that protects the axon, and it facilitates the transmission of information. And so we know in some people who have things like multiple sclerosis, for example, that when the myelin breaks down, they have slower processing speed. We also know that myelin development doesn't happen until much later in development, into your 20s. So, but one possible hypothesis for slower processing speed is that in some kids they may have thinner myelin, the myelin development might be delayed in them. And then one other reason for a biological driven mechanism is that perhaps that space between the cells are a little bit bigger in people. And we're talking about a little bit, we're talking about tiny, tiny spaces. But that it may be that that's how some people's brains, sorry, I'm just having trouble with this, have developed, is that the spaces are larger and it takes the neurotransmitters longer to travel, so the messages are sent more slowly. Again, these are all kinds of preliminary studies that have been done by people in various fields. And then just one last thing, I have to mention at least the frontal lobes, because the frontal lobes are that area of the brain that's very important for executive function skills, also thought to be very important for processing speed. And there have been some studies that have shown, again here, that the smaller frontal lobe, as defined by white and gray matter in the brain, can mean slower processing speed too. So I'm really just glossing over this, but I just want to give you the sense, though, that this is not a willful thing. And one reason why I think that's important is because it feels so willful. When you have a child, either you're parenting a child with slower processing speed, or you have a child in your classroom, or you're working with a child with slower processing speed, it feels like just pick up the pencil. It's not that hard. Just get going. But it's not that easy for them. So now what I want to do is talk a little bit about my own research at Mass General, and we have been looking at processing speed in our bigger sample, and actually I did not update this. I updated a lot of these slides, but we actually have 1,500 people in our sample right now, 1,500 families. The rest of it is correct here. And we wanted to look at, so what do these kids look like? And so we looked at boys versus girls and other areas of cognition. And so a few facts here just to start. So boys are more affected than girls are. I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a second. So 70% of the kids in our sample who had slower processing speed were boys. There might be some reasons for that we've hypothesized. A lot of the tests that I've shown you, especially that coding subtest, it really pulls a lot for fine motor skills, which we know aren't as quick for boys. They're slower at fine motor tasks, especially when they're younger. People have hypothesized that maybe there's a bit of a gender bias in teachers, especially where it comes to handwriting. Oh, he's a boy, his handwriting isn't that good, that's fine. So that might be part of the reason, but I think it's probably a little bit that there might be a true gender bias in this. I said before that social difficulties are common. In a third of these kids, their parents had reported social difficulties. And you can imagine when you have slower processing speed that social relationships really happen in real time and they're fast. And so when I talk to parents who say that their kids have problems with social skills, who also have this profile, sometimes they've been referred to me because there's a rule out of autism spectrum. And many of these kids do not have an autism spectrum disorder, but yet they're having trouble socially because they can't keep up with the fast-paced social interactions that they're confronted with every day. Most of the kids that we saw in our clinic when they came to our clinic, were already receiving IEP support or 504 support, which shows how big of an impact this has on academic functioning. Now remember, they're coming to my clinic to get help, like what do we do with our child? And they're already getting services. Sometimes they're not diagnosed, or it's not clear as to what the diagnosis is, but they're getting services. And I said earlier, it's not the same thing as ADHD. Only 61% of the kids with ADHD had processing speed deficits. Sorry. And so just to give you a sense of, so what do these kids look like? So I just have here different diagnoses and the percentage of kids who have slower processing speed who meet that criteria. So you can see that it cuts across kids with a lot of different disorders. So I want to just talk to you a little bit about what this looks like, what our sample looks like, and how this compares to other areas of cognitive functioning. So you can see here, so these are WISC profiles, and so at the bottom you can see processing speed, and then there's working memory index, general ability index, and then full-scale IQ. So the general ability index on the WISC is, and I'm assuming most of you know that the Wechsler intelligence scales for children, but the general ability index is intelligence without the processing speed and working memory factors. And you can see that there were significant differences related to young girls versus young boys. Like I said, this seems to affect boys more than girls. And again, this is a clinical sample, so these are kids with various kinds of issues. It's also important to note that both boys and girls performed below 100 on processing speed. So 100 is the average, and the standard deviation is 15. So you can see that our average child in our sample here is still slower than the average kid on processing speed. And it's slower than their intellectual skills. And a similar pattern was found in the older age group. So that was younger kids. These are older kids with girls performing significantly better than boys, but again, not on any of the other Wechsler scales. So again, kind of showing that this tends to be a more significant problem for boys than girls, at least in our sample. And then one question I get an awful lot is, does processing speed improve with age? And I'm going to tell you what my clinical impressions are, having followed a lot of the same kids over years. I find that there are some kids who tend to catch up, meaning they kind of jump the curve when it comes to processing speed. And then there are other kids who tend to lag behind. Our research tends to show that there's a problem, this is a problem more for boys than it is with girls. So you can kind of see that there's an age factor with boys 6 to 10, sorry that this doesn't look, but you can see, and then 11 to 20, that it tends to actually get, in our sample, that processing speed in this sample tends to get slower for the average boy in our sample. But that did not hold true for girls. So one thing to keep in mind, again, people really want to know, is my child ever going to get faster? So I see a child at age 8, they're really struggling. I see them again at age 10, they're really struggling. The parents want to say, will they ever be able to go to college? And yes, most of these kids are able to go to college, but we don't know how this develops over time. And again, thinking about brain development, we don't know in certain kids, is this just a delayed development in some area of the brain, or is this a more static trait for some of these kids? Now, we've tried to look at this cross-sectionally, meaning we looked at kids ages 6 to 9, ages 10 to 13, and ages 13 to 21. Our study is longitudinal, so hopefully we'll have more information on the actual kids as they age, but for right now we can only look at this cross-sectionally. So what this kind of shows is, do problems with processing speed increase over time? It does seem to be the case for boys, that it is something that, at least in our sample, there may be some difference between boys and girls. And really all this shows is that we've got some ideas, some hypotheses about what to look at. So again, this is just another sample of that. Let me also talk to you about how processing speed affects kids with different disorders. So what this graph shows and the next one shows are kids who have different symptoms of anxiety, inattention, and social problems. And you can see kids with slower processing speed, those with average processing speed, and fast processing speed. So let me start on the right-hand side of the graph. So social problems. What we find is that kids with, again, slower processing speed have significantly more problems socially, at least as reported by their parents. They have more problems with attention. So that's what that graph shows, that the kids with processing speed have significantly more problems with attention. But in anxiety, it's a little bit more complicated. What we find is that kids with anxiety are significantly more likely to have slow processing speed and also fast processing speed. So kids who are anxious tend to fall in one of those groups more often than the average child, the child with average processing speed, meaning that there's kind of a good zone for anxiety. So if you're really, if you're really a fast processor, you're more likely to have significant or more significant symptoms of anxiety than you are if you're an average processor. So you can kind of think about it. What we know about anxiety is that there is kind of a sweet spot for anxiety. Too much isn't good, too little also isn't good, but there's that right amount. So that was something that's interesting. And then when we looked at other areas of functioning, what we found is that kids with learning problems of all types were significantly more likely to have slower processing speed. And kids with sort of overall problems on the child behavior checklist. But what was interesting to us is that kids with more oppositional and conduct problems were not more likely to have problems with processing speed. Meaning, again, that this is not something that comes along with kind of those conduct issues or oppositional issues. This isn't something that's associated with those sorts of problems. Just something to kind of keep in mind. So what does this mean for like the real child in the real world? Well, I think of these kids in a few different categories. And my first category is the child that I refer to as Mr. Chill child. And this child is the one who sort of takes on the persona of the slow one. They wear it as a badge of honor. So they're the kind of child who's like, Mom, you're just too crazy. You know, you need to slow down. Don't get so hyped up about everything. You know, everything's gonna be fine. They sometimes say, and I'm using this word, which I realize now is not a word that's used all over, but it's a Boston word. Those kids who do everything on time are noobs, like, you know, nerds, whatever you want to say, but they're the kids who, like, you know, cool people don't do things on time, Mom, or, you know. They act as if they don't really care, but they really do. And so they have this sort of persona that's sort of like, oh, it's fine if I don't get it done. But inside, they're very often anxious. Some teachers view that chilling as laziness, and it's probably too much of a good thing. I should add too that, again, this is only my clinical insight here, but I find that a lot of times kids with this kind of persona, when they get into high school, their drug of choice tends to be marijuana, which is now legal in Massachusetts, which is perhaps not, well, I'm not going to comment on that, but anyway, it tends to be their drug of choice. And I just find it over and over again, and in fact, it's so, you know, it's something that we see so much that we're actually looking at this, but I don't have any data to present on that yet. And, you know, I've told kids this, that it's a bad drug for the adolescent brain, period. You know, all of the research that has come out recently has shown that it's just a bad choice for kids to do in adolescence. But I've always been curious as to why kids who are already so slow at executing tasks, why would they be drawn to a drug that just makes them even slower? And I finally asked, not that long ago, and I would actually, to adolescents, I would actually say this to them, like, you know, this is just a bad choice for you. It's a bad choice for all these reasons. But for you in particular, it's a really bad choice. Why would you choose this? And this adolescent boy said to me, because when I'm with everybody else, they're all down to my level. And now I can talk at a level and that is at my pace. And that just, in fact, he sort of said, I don't even smoke all that much, but I like to be with people who do, because when they do, the conversation is kind of at my pace. And it like made me realize, oh, yeah, that's probably true. And I said, still not a good idea. It's not a good idea. So then the other category of kids, so that's one category of kids, and again, this is just kind of a way of sort of conceptualizing kids at a day-to-day level. And I don't think these categories are necessarily static. But the next category of child that I kind of lump kids in is the Mr. Anxiety kid. So they're the child who, because they have weak processing speed, it causes them to be anxious, and the anxiety slows them down further. Or perhaps they're anxious to begin with, it gives them a slower processing speed. And at home and school, and sometimes at school they have meltdowns. Oftentimes it's a child who really tries very hard at school to get everything done, working to capacity every moment, and they get in the car at the end of the day and carpool, and they start screaming, and the teacher is completely baffled why this wonderful child in the classroom has these complete, you know, the parents reporting these complete meltdowns and temper tantrums once they get in the car and all through homework time. And then the other category of child is the lost child. And that's the child who tends to just be, they're neither, you know, anxious nor are they completely chill, they're just kind of lost. And they're kind of, they sometimes present as a little oblivious to their surroundings. The teacher gives them something to take to the office, and 10 minutes later they're still wandering around, forgetting where they're supposed to be or why they're on their way. And sometimes people will incorrectly think these kids just aren't bright. but it's not true. And the teachers who have time to find that diamond in the rough are really perfect for this kind of child. Now sometimes what I find is that a child might start out like this in 2nd grade, and by the time they reach 6th or 7th grade, they start to become anxious, and then by the time they get into 10th grade, they feel like, okay, I'm just going to chill, I'm going to be a stoner, and I'll just cope with it this way. And so these aren't static categories, but it's a way to kind of think about these kids and to kind of see them in their natural surroundings. So what can be done? Well, I know that I wish I had a list of things that were perfect for every child. As you can see, we're only learning about this, and we're only starting to understand how it relates to someone's learning profile and other disorders such as anxiety and depression and learning disabilities. So there aren't any treatments. There isn't a medication that's going to speed up somebody's brain, although that may be where the field is going in the next decade or two. But medication can sometimes be very helpful for other disorders. So if a child has ADHD, or if they have depression or anxiety, medication can be helpful in treating those sorts of issues. Also, any kind of treatment for learning disabilities can be very helpful. Tutoring for things like executive function skills to make life more efficient. And that's the one thing I always tell parents and teachers, any way you can make life more efficient. If we're slower at anything, and all of us have things that we're slow at, and what do we do in order to speed it up? We try and make it more efficient. We try and make things more so that we don't have to think about it as much, where it becomes automatic. So anytime we can make any aspect of learning more automatic to save sort of that brain power for the more thinking skills, the better. Otherwise, we came up with this idea of sort of the 3 A's of processing speed: to accept, to accommodate, and to advocate. So acceptance is the first thing, but before I get into that, I want to just talk a little bit about what shouldn't be done, because it's way easier to do the things that we shouldn't do. So what shouldn't be done? Yelling, screaming, shouting. It doesn't generally work, and it definitely doesn't work well. Now I'm going to self-disclose here a little bit, because I have a son with exactly this profile who's got inattentive subtype ADHD, a little bit of dyslexia, and to be honest, I didn't get interested in this because of him. It was sort of like as I became more, learned more about this, I realized, oh my gosh, this is really my son. And he's okay with me sharing this. In fact, he's done a few podcasts on this, the whole idea of processing speed and what it feels like. But at one point, when he was probably in, I don't know, 3rd or 4th grade, I said to him, maybe 5th grade, I said to him, Peter, you have to come up with a way of getting you to do your homework that doesn't involve me screaming at you every night. And he says to me, Mom, screaming actually helps me. And I said, well, I don't like it. And what he meant that it helped him is that it got his nervous system aroused to the point where he did something. But it didn't make him feel very good about himself in the long run. It made me feel like a really bad mom. And so we had to come up with different ways. And even just, again, kind of when I'm talking about those 3 A's of processing speed, accepting this, that, wait a minute, here's what we're doing, and what's the real problem here? So anyway, the other thing that shouldn't be done, which I hear almost every week in my office, is referring to the child as lazy. I mean, parents just say, dads more than moms, I hate to generalize, but more than moms will say, he's just lazy. He's just like I was when I was a kid, and I was lazy. So it's not as if they're just even putting down their child, but they oftentimes have the same kind of profile, and I just have to finish, and there's usually another reason for the behavior. Oftentimes it's processing speed, but sometimes it's other things too. A lack of self-confidence or depression or anxiety. But I've yet to meet a child under the age of late adolescence who is truly lazy. There's usually another reason for that, and if they look lazy, it's usually a persona that they've used to cope with the fact that they can't do what they're being asked to do. I also just want to mention that there's an emotional consequence of processing speed, and that you start with the slower processing speed, which leads to problems in daily life. They can be academic problems, family stress, peer problems, which can lead to emotional difficulties like anxiety, lower self-esteem, depression, which then leads to psychological consequences like perfectionism, low motivation, sort of the depletion of cognitive resources, like I'm just tired because I'm working so hard, which leads then to slower processing speed. So you have to kind of think about this in a very complex way, that just telling someone to speed up, which many of us do, I've been guilty of it myself, it doesn't take into account these other emotions, this other layer of emotional issues that can go on when you feel like you're always a step behind. So again, so what do? So acceptance is the first thing, and I think the first issue or the first task is to get information. And I've been in so many meetings with parents where I've shown them their child's cognitive profile, and they have this like aha moment, like, oh, so you mean he's bright when he has to talk about things, he's bright when he has to solve problems, but when you ask him to do these very simple tasks, he's really slow at being able to execute those. And they understand then how that translates into the classroom, and it translates into acceptance, that this isn't something, again, that's willful, but something that needs to be accepted. Knowing that it's going to take longer can just make it better all of a sudden. Like parents sometimes, within 45 minutes of going over their child's cognitive profile, they feel like, oh, I feel so much better. And very often, one of the parents can say, he's just like me. And learning to value that aspect of the child's personality is really important. You know, I get asked a lot, and I apologize for not talking about the positive aspects of this profile, but you know, we do so much in our society to slow ourselves down. We do the mindfulness training, we go to the yoga studio, we do all of these things to help us become more slow. These kids have that naturally. They, you know, I kind of like refer to my son, and actually his older sister, who's very different from him, refer to him as one point like he's our family's Buddha. And it is kind of true that there's a lot that they can teach us about kind of like just taking your time. So learning to accept this is important. I mentioned too, like acceptance might be getting a tutor, getting tutoring if they also have dyslexia, for example, or getting executive function coaching or that sort of thing. But acceptance is key. Along with that is accommodation, because we don't have any, this isn't like dyslexia where, you know, rule-based, phonics-based approaches to reading are going to help. We don't know that yet. So one of the ways to really fix this as best we can for now is to accommodate the child's needs. Extra time is really important. Use of technology and smart use of technology. You know, in the school system where my kids went to school, teachers put all of the kids' homework on their websites. And initially I thought this was a wonderful thing. But what I keep finding out is that each teacher had her own website. So instead of having just a notebook where you just every day took down your notes and you wrote down what you had to do and it was on one little page, kids had to go to each teacher's website and look up what they had to do for class the next day. That's a bad use of technology, and kids with slower processing speed, all of those little clicks, all of that little getting organized at the computer, it's not just, you know, it's not just like processing the information, but also it just takes them longer to do a whole lot of things. And so a smart use of technology is important. And then also, I think I mentioned developing compensatory strategies that are organized, better time management skills. Anecdotally, one thing that I noticed with kids, and I mentioned this before who have this profile, is they have a very poor concept of time. And I don't know why that is. It's something that we, again, want to look at and study. But you would think that if it took you longer to get things done, you would be more apt to be more aware of how much time you had left. I find that many times kids have a much more optimistic view of how long it'll take them to get. So if it takes the average person 30 minutes to do this assignment, they think they'll get it done in 20. And I don't know if there's an emotional component to that. Like, you know, in reality, it could take us, you know, an hour, or maybe I'm not going to get it done at all tonight, so I'll get that done in 20 minutes, don't worry. But I think teaching time, teaching, how long did that take you? That took you 10 minutes, or being very aware, even in the school day, of how much time is budgeted for different things, helps them develop an internal mechanism for how long it's going to take them to do something. And then the last part of this is advocating. And that's at the parent level, it's at the teacher level. Teachers often need to advocate to other teachers, next year's teacher, or in the high school level, advocating to, teachers need to talk to one another to better understand what a child needs across the curriculum. But ultimately, my goal in working with families is that the child is able to verbalize this about himself. There's a lot of data that shows that kids who have learning disabilities who reach college are actually more resilient than kids in college who don't have learning disabilities. But the key factor in that is your ability to articulate what it is that, what it is in your cognitive profile that makes you who you are. So your ability to be able to say as a child, oh, wait a minute, can you just say that again? I didn't get that. Very simple things that can actually bring the environment more into your zone of comfort. So there's more information in my book on processing speed, and like I said, it's one of those things that can be hard to figure out exactly what to do. I actually look to you guys to get information about that, to see what's happening in your classrooms, and as parents, how you're coping with that. And like I said, I do work, one of my roles at Mass General is at an organization called the Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds. And we do have a number of webinars. We have a processing speed video that we produced on this. And like I said, I feel comfortable talking about my son because he also did a couple of podcasts on how it feels to live with processing speed issues. I was actually on the panel, as you might guess. He and I have very different processing speed styles, and I also talk about that. I didn't have time to talk about that today, but looking at the match between you and your child, or you as a teacher and the kids in your class, is important. So I'm going to wrap up there because I know we have other things to do. Thank you so much for having me today, and thanks.